Thank you so much for making the time to come and participate in this very exciting project that we have about PEPFAR to document the global oral history of PEPFAR from the beginning up to now. So my name is Nazanin, and I'm happy to have Nazanin Ash on this day, June 24th at 16:21 hours in Washington, D.C. So I'm just going to start off and ask you to please tell us about yourself. Who are you? Who's your family? Where you were born, and where did you do your school?
I'm Nazanin Ash. My maiden name is Nazanin Semeri Kermani. My family came to the United States from Iran. They came as exchange students and had me rather accidentally while they were still students. And then the Iranian Revolution happened when they were, when my dad was completing his PhD. It was the last year of his PhD program. And they were worried about my future in Iran. And so they made a very painful decision to stay. But it means that I grew up here in the United States, moved around quite a bit in the Midwest, and ultimately moved to Southern California when I was 10 and a half, came east to go to college at Bryn Mawr College, and I went to Harvard Kennedy School for my graduate degree in public policy, and I went to work for Action Aid Kenya. I did my master's thesis with Action Aid Kenya when I was at the Harvard Kennedy School. And I did it on how Action Aid Kenya could have a stronger voice in advocating for better HIV/AIDS response from the national government and from multilateral institutions. And at the end of that project, Action Aid Kenya asked if I'd come to help implement it for a year after graduate school. And so I agreed to help and come and implement the project. And while I was overseas with Action Aid Kenya, I heard George W. Bush's State of the Union speech where he announced the launch of the president's emergency plan for AIDS relief. And I was blown away because I had been living and working in Kenya, and I had been dreaming about what I wished global powers would do about the HIV/AIDS pandemic that was ravaging societies all over Kenya that I was seeing up close, but also all over poor and disenfranchised populations across Eastern and Southern and Western Africa, but also many other nations. And I'd been dreaming about what I wish global powers would do differently. And so when I saw the president announce his intention to really take on global AIDS, I made a vow that I really wanted to be part of that.
Fascinating. Just looking at like your history as a family and being in the US and now going to Africa, supposedly doing a study, and then you get co-opted now, not only studying what you are interested in, but you get an opportunity to now do and be part of the role players in the response. I just want to backtrack a little bit. I want to hear a bit more about how long were you in Kenya? Like now with Action Aid, because you went for studying and then you were with Action Aid. How long were you there for, and what role were you playing within?
So when
Action
I
Aid?
first went, I went for 10 weeks for a summer internship between my first and second year in graduate school. And then on the heels of that internship, I decided to do my master's thesis with ActionAid Kenya, because the way you do your master's thesis at Harvard Kennedy School is you pick essentially a client and you help that client solve a problem that they've been trying to solve. And, I had been involved in the Student Global AIDS campaign on Harvard's campus. And before that, I had been an HIV/AIDS educator in my youth, when I was in high school and during college. So I had come to this with an interest for a long time, both domestically and then internationally around HIV/AIDS advocacy. So when I did this internship with ActionAid Kenya, I was really compelled by their approach. ActionAid Kenya is uniquely all Kenyan. So it's, everyone except the country director, and he was from India and had long worked in East Africa. But everyone except the country director was Kenyan, and they were from the development initiative sites that ActionAid sought to serve. So at once it was a tremendous asset, an enormous asset in being able to talk about HIV/AIDS. And at the same time, as my country director pointed out, almost because they came from all the same communities, they were raised with the same cultural stigmas and fears around HIV/AIDS. And so even though, we all saw it as a tremendous strength that it was a Kenyan organization, my country director's really wonderful insight was that it would be helpful to have somebody come and work with the staff and train with the staff on advocacy methodologies and how they could best use their tremendous voice and credibility in communities all across Kenya to advocate for better HIV/AIDS response from the government. So that's how I came to do the internship with ActionAid. And then, as noted, I decided I wanted to do a thesis project with them. And at the Kennedy School, you do your thesis project with a partner or partners, because it's designed to be like a real life situation where you work with a client and a group of advisors. And so I had a partner that I worked on with the thesis. And so we went back to Kenya for research over the course of our thesis year with the Kennedy School. And as noted, at the end of that thesis project, ActionAid invited me to come and help implement. And then I lived and worked in Kenya for about a year as a program officer on their HIV/AIDS team, working with another incredible mentor, Dr. Uma, who led their HIV/AIDS program response team.
Okay. You're getting me interested in a number of tangents, so I'm just
Where are you from, Tandika?
I'm from Swaziland.
Uh-huh.
Yes. So my first follow-up question is about what was your main finding that was very interesting when you were doing a thesis project with them?
Oh, now you're asking me to think back a long time, but the crux of the main finding was that, and it's something that has informed my advocacy throughout my life, the crux of the finding was that there was lacking within Kenya, or really within the global AIDS advocacy movement, outside of a couple of unique communities, for example, in South Africa, there was lacking a Kenyan voice for advocacy. And so the conversation was very much between government counterparts and international organizations, whether it was the World Bank at the time was an early investor in HIV/AIDS responses. But it was a conversation that did not seem to sufficiently engage communities who were being deeply impacted. And what we saw in Kenya at the time, which was deeply concerning, was the Kenyan government was engaged in conversations with the World Bank about HIV/AIDS response. They were receiving financing from the World Bank and from other international institutions, often in the form of loans, to respond to HIV/AIDS, within the country. And yet that response wasn't being seen and felt in communities. And so the finding was really around how could ActionAid as an organization help cultivate and empower the voice of Kenyan citizens and Kenyan communities as advocates for themselves for a stronger and better HIV/AIDS response. And a huge part of unlocking that voice and advocacy was HIV/AIDS education and overcoming so much of the stigma and fear that was associated with HIV and talking about it in community. And that's where it seemed like there were no better leaders and representatives than people from the community. Much better to have people from the community than outsiders who didn't feel of the culture or of the community coming in to talk about HIV/AIDS. So the primary finding was around cultivating that innate strength of ActionAid Kenya in having so many Kenyan leaders on their team, cultivating that strength and empowering those leaders to help enable community voices to advocate around better responses for HIV.
So you're a postgrad at Harvard, and I'm sure you have to choose which country you want to go to. Why Kenya out of so many other countries? How did you get to Kenya?
The story is even better than that, Thandeka, because coming out of the completion of my graduate degree, I was accepted into the Presidential Management Fellow with the United States government. And if you are a public policy student, getting accepted as a Presidential Management Fellow into a government job is one of the ideal scenarios when you're graduating from the master's program in public policy, right? We all want to work in government. We all want to influence policy. It's a school of government. So coming out with an offer to start as a Presidential Management Fellowship program, which is a fellowship program that allows you to come in at middle management in U.S. government and then accelerate very quickly in your career. So it's like it's a really great path to government employment in the U.S. government. And I had an offer to do a Presidential Management Fellowship. And then I had an offer from ActionAid Kenya to come and work as a program officer, getting a Kenyan salary, because it was very important to them not to have the imbalances of like expatriate salaries. So the offer was come and work in a role within our organization, a program officer, getting a Kenyan salary. And I had I had massive amounts of student loans to pay at Harvard. I couldn't afford it. But I really wanted to do it because it's where my heart was. And I had been I just had such an incredible experience working with the organization, working with their leadership in communities in Kenya. I was really just moved by the opportunity. So I applied for a scholarship from Harvard to be able to go and do this project with ActionAid Kenya. So at least I'd be able to pay for housing and that kind of thing. And then I applied to Harvard to halt my loans so I wouldn't have to make loan payments while I was doing this year-long fellowship program with ActionAid Kenya. And they agreed to both, I was lucky enough to receive the fellowship, and Harvard generously allowed me to defer payment on my student loans. And then I went to the Presidential Management Fellows Program and I asked them if I could defer my acceptance for a year. I said, I have this offer to go work in the field for a year. Can I do this and then defer my, Presidential Management Fellowship? And they wouldn't let me defer my fellowship. So then I faced this really crazy choice, and my parents thought I was crazy, but I turned down the Presidential Management Fellowship and I went to Kenya to work for ActionAid. And it's because I was compelled by ActionAid Kenya and their staff and their leadership and their commitment and their knowledge and their expertise and their passion and the belief that there was no one better who could really unlock Kenyan communities and be a legitimate, credible voice for Kenyans. And my country director was super interesting, Thomas Joseph, who's a titan of a mentor to me. Dr. Uma as well, a titan of a mentor to me. And they were both very interesting because I said, why are you inviting me to come and work with ActionAid Kenya when I've just, been part of writing this thesis that said that the strength of your organization was in having Kenyan leadership? And they were the ones that pointed out that because we have Kenyan leadership, they grew up with the confusion and fear and stigma around HIV/AIDS. We don't want you to be the one talking to community members. We want you to be the one training our staff, and they will go out and do the work.
Good compliment.
It was really insightful. So I was just really compelled by the insightfulness of the leadership, the commitment of the team at ActionAid. I had the most extraordinary year with them. What I learned from all of those leaders and my fellow colleagues at ActionAid Kenya has informed the whole trajectory of my professional life.
How was it for you culturally to immerse and integrate with Kenya?
Oh, it was so fascinating. It is actually, I often describe that time as learning that I was American. Because, as I mentioned, I was born here in the United States in Kansas to Iranian parents. So I was born here in the United States in Kansas to Iranian parents. And I grew up in the Midwest during the hostage crisis years. So there was, it was a tough time to be Iranian and to live in communities where I was often, I and my family were often the only Iranians. And, I was the only one who was brown. I was the only one who, had parents that spoke with accents. So it's a really difficult time. And I grew up with people asking me, where are you from? And I'd say I was born in Kansas. They'd be like, no, where are you really from? And then you say oh, well, my family's Iranian. It was it was a really difficult time. So I grew up my whole life, answering the where are you from question by saying that I'm Iranian, right? Or my family's from Iran. And then when I went to Kenya, I remember very distinctly sort of, getting into a taxi and the cab driver would say, where are you from? And I'd give the same answer that I gave when I lived in the United States, because it was what I was used to saying. I'd say, well, I'm Iranian. And the taxi driver said, well, but you speak such good English. And I said, oh, that's because I was born in the United States. And he said, oh, so you're American. And I was like, I guess you're right. I'm American. So it's where I came to own my American identity. And it's where I came to actually take enormous pride in my American identity. Because the other thing that was interesting about immersing in Kenyan culture was my observation was that the relationship of citizens to their state and to their government was very different than the relationship of citizens to their government here in the United States. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what I mean by that.
I was going to ask how.
Well, I remember, for example, being in a community meeting, like being an observer in a community meeting, and the local MP, the local member of parliament was coming to visit their constituencies. And the local MP, walked in like he owned the room, and everybody in the room stood up immediately, to pay their respects. And I was the last person in the room to stand up. I was like, oh, I'm supposed to stand. Because, here in the United States, our politicians work for us. We think of, if my congressional representative was coming into a room, I'd be like, what have you done for us lately? You know what I mean? Like, it's much more of an accountability relationship. So citizens, so it was very strange to me to experience citizens being so deferential to their politicians. And I remember, having conversations with community members and learning about, I just remember very distinctly one conversation with a community member, and we were talking about local responses to HIV/AIDS. And some of what I'd hear from community members were things like, oh, but what can the government do about it? And I would be describing, for example, like, well, your government has actually taken out millions of dollars in loans to help respond to HIV, and you should be feeling that in your, you should be seeing and feeling that in your community. Anyway, the end of this conversation, the woman shared, okay, well, we will not take the sugar from our MP this year. And I was like, what do you mean? And it was every year you get a bag of sugar and a request to vote a certain way. And she was like, this year I'm not going to take the sugar. And it was like these interesting lessons in meaningful democracy and citizens feeling empowered to hold their governments accountable, which is something I felt all the time in the United States. Like our cultural relationship with our government is very different. So it's where I learned to appreciate that I was American and learned to appreciate being American and owning an American identity. Sorry, that was a really long answer.
It's okay. Now we are in Kenya. You are working on these public policy issues and your interest in Africa, and you want to see Kenya really doing much more, being in the forefront of the HIV response. And then, bam, President Bush is making that announcement in his State of the Union address. What came to your mind? I know you just
wanted to be part of it.
Like, I just want you to elaborate a bit, like the emotion, like if you can relive that moment,
I thought it was incredible that, again, here I had been wishing about what I hoped, superpowers would do about this. And then here you had, one of the greatest superpowers making an enormous commitment to combat global HIV/AIDS. And I really wanted to be a part of it. And very naively, I applied for a different government program. I applied for the White House Fellowship. And that's a program that takes about 12 to 16 fellows every year. They take them from many different sectors. They take them from the military, from the private sector, from the NGO sector, from the journalism sector. They select, 12 to 16 young professionals who are early in their careers. And the idea is to come into government for a year and you work at a high level. You get assigned to a Secretary of State, and not a Secretary of State, you get assigned to a cabinet member, you get assigned to a cabinet secretary, and you sort of shadow their leadership and see the inner workings of policy making for a year. And you have an incredible education program alongside it that's about learning about government policy making at the highest levels and what influences decision making. And because I'd given up my presidential management fellowship, I couldn't think of a different or better way to to go back into government. So I rather naively applied for this fellowship because, first of all, not many people get it. And second of all, when you get the fellowship, there's no guarantee that you'll be assigned to the agency that you want to work with. And I only wanted to work on PEPFAR. I only wanted to work on the launch of this HIV/AIDS program, and there's no guarantee that you will. So it was quite naive. I got very lucky to be selected for the program. And then the story has been told to me, so I can't independently verify this, but the story as it was told to me, I interviewed with 8 different U.S. government agencies. Once you're selected for the fellowship, you interview with different agencies to ultimately get placed with a cabinet agency. And as I mentioned, you have no real choice in the matter. So you just interview with anyone who wants to interview you. But I was very clear in my interview with the Department of State, which is where they were going to be developing the HIV/AIDS initiative, that I deeply wanted to work on the design of that program. And I interviewed with Secretary Powell's chief of staff, an extraordinary leader by the name of Colonel Wilkerson. And the story as it was told to me, so again, I can't independently verify this, is that Secretary Powell said that I was the only White House fellow they wanted to have at the State Department, because Secretary Powell also felt very strongly about responding to the global AIDS pandemic. And he appreciated the fact that I had lived and worked in Kenya, and I'd lived and worked on issues of how to best respond to HIV/AIDS. And so he thought that would be an asset to the program. So it worked out. But I also, interestingly and different from my fellow White House fellows, I didn't work directly with Secretary Powell. I wanted to work with the leadership that was setting up the global AIDS program. So I was really lucky to be able to be part of the founding team that was designing the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS relief. And I took a box on the org chart, of that group of that team in designing the program.
I'm trying to think where to follow up. Because the announcement, you're in Kenya, right in the, in the thick of where this pandemic is happening, but there's this, release that's coming through, and for something that's going to help the community and the country. I mean, did they understand in Kenya, what does this mean?
I don't think so. Not then. I think people were not sure what it would mean until the full, at that point it was still sort of under development. So I don't think people understood the full import in the State of the Union speech. I think it was an enormous accomplishment. It was a big statement to make. But I think, as with any statement, people want to wait and see if there's a there. Are these just words, or are there major actions that are associated with it? And what followed the president's speech was legislation in Congress that authorized the program, appropriations from Congress that funded the program. All those things needed to happen before President Bush's intention could be made real. And so I think initially there was a lot of interest and maybe let's wait and see. I was far too naive to sort of understand any of those dynamics. So I was just, I thought it was happening. I was excited it was happening. I wanted to be on the ground, right on the ground working on it. But, there was a really amazing team led by Joe O'Neill and many others out of the White House who who worked with Congress and the George W. Bush White House to get the initial legislation designed and passed. It was, passed on a bipartisan basis. It was an extraordinary feat of bringing many multi-sectoral voices to the table to pass this bipartisan legislation. It was really, that's a story unto itself. But I think it wasn't until even when the focus countries were first announced, then I think people really stood up and took notice, because, okay, well, there's focus countries. It sounds like they're going to be receiving some additional resources. Then I think people really stood up and took notice. But it wasn't until planning started happening and resources started flowing that people really understood that this was a very different commitment than what the US government had done before. And it was going to be done in a very different way.
Okay. I just also want to touch on what was the impression of the pandemic in Kenya?
Wow,
I know we spoke about the capacity of the organization, but I mean, generally,
it was devastating. It was devastating. I think one of the things that people didn't really grasp about HIV/AIDS, and I don't know who exactly I mean by people. I guess I mean the general public. I think one of the things that people really didn't understand was not only that it was a pandemic and it was that it was impacting many individuals, but it was, I remember seeing a visual of this from the World Bank that stayed with me forever, which is what you normally want to see in a population is something of a pyramid. You've got a lot of young people at the bottom, and then the pyramid gets narrower as you go to the top. But it's this middle layer of people between the ages of 15 and 45 who are really the crux of your country, right? They are your most productive population. They're the people who are working. They're the people who are producing. They are the people who take care of the very young and the very old, right? They are parents and they're taking care of their parents, right? So this middle part of the pyramid is so important. And who was most impacted by HIV/AIDS? People between the ages of 15 and 45. So it was hollowing out the pyramids. It was population pyramids in Eastern and Southern Africa especially were no longer looking like this. They were looking like an hourglass. And this population that's supposed to take care of the very young and the very old, they're your government workers, they're your business owners, they're people in the military, they're you're the crux of your critical population. They were being deeply impacted. And the reverberations of that were so tremendous in terms of, development trajectories, economies, security, politics, the potential impacts of that, the humanitarian and other impacts of that were so tremendous. And I didn't feel like that was being very well understood globally. But when I was on the ground in communities in Kenya, you could see it everywhere, and it was devastating. It was devastating. Nobody was untouched by it.
So prior to your coming to Action Aid Kenya, so what kind of mandate were they carrying out, as an organization? What was the core business of Action Aid?
They're a development organization, and at the time I was with them, they worked in what were called development initiative locations. There were 26 of them all over the country in some of the most impoverished and vulnerable parts of the country. And they ran community initiatives to address barriers to community development that were identified by those communities themselves.
Are there any HIV response specific type of activities that were already doing?
There was a growing HIV/AIDS response program that was being developed under Dr. Uma's leadership. That was largely around HIV/AIDS education, but also some health and support interventions. So, Dr. Uma, being a doctor, was helping to build out some health interventions for HIV, and he was building out some community support centers. So, I think of orphanages where, you had orphaned children who had been orphaned by HIV/AIDS, so support to those kinds of community institutions that were caring for people who had been impacted by HIV. But what the organization had yet to develop was a national HIV/AIDS advocacy strategy.
So did your type of role take you to interact with government actors?
Very limited.
Very limited.
Very limited. I mean, again, I wasn't the credible voice in interacting with governments, and that was sort of like the central finding, right? Is that government should be accountable to its citizens. It's never going to be accountable to expatriates or really even to donors, or to international institutions. It needs to be most accountable to its citizens. And that was the real missing link, the citizens demanding better service in responding to HIV/AIDS.
So you did mention earlier that one of the things you noted was that you wanted really to be the engine within the office to train and build capacity for advocacy for the staff so that they are the ones going out to their own people. So did you not have a chance, or did you have to be going to communities yourself, or you were mostly grounded within the office?
Oh, I mostly went to communities because that's where I met and worked with and collaborated with the local ActionAid staff who were in those communities. So we did a few sessions throughout the year where community leaders came and gathered together. Like, I think we had one organization-wide retreat, if I remember correctly. But mostly what I was doing was going out to those locations and doing sort of an advocacy training program in each development initiative site. So I was all over the country. I think I'm not wrong that I went to if I remember correctly, I went to all of the development initiative sites.
6 sites.
I think so.
Okay, so when you come to a typical Kenyan community, how's the structure like? I mean, who do you work with? Is there some kind of hierarchy, some structure that you found in place? Like different role players? Who are the most active people that you were working and dealing with?
I would be working with the local HIV/AIDS staff. The local ActionAid staff who lived and worked in those communities.
Oh, they stayed within
they stayed in the community. So there's a local ActionAid office. And usually between 2 to 5, if it was a larger community, more people, but typically there were like 2 to 5 ActionAid staff members that lived and worked in that community. And as I mentioned, they were from that community most often. So I would stay locally in the community, and I would be working with the local ActionAid staff who were there.
Did you feel there was a strong faith-based type of response at that time, especially before there was treatment to HIV? What was the role of the churches and other faith-based organizations? within the community level?
I think in every community, here's what I'm trying to say. In every community, it was about understanding who were the sort of cultural leaders in that community, and how could they be brought into the conversation and influenced to have a more open dialogue and a more accepting dialogue around HIV. And that varied. Sometimes those were faith leaders. Sometimes those were, women's groups in the community. Sometimes those were tribal leaders, like that. It really varied, as to who was the most influential.
I see. So you come in and you realize there is this void, and you train, you build capacity. Is there any example that you can tell us about, like your successful output, in terms of what you, as a result of your investment or your training, like they were at this level, or this is what the perspective was, and then they changed, or there was this transformation that took place, or you were there for a short time to be able to tell of any changes?
Yes, I think I'd say, over the course of, and it wasn't just me at all. I mean, as I was a program officer on Dr. Uma's team, and our Action AIDS leadership was very embracing of, taking a different approach on HIV/AIDS. But I would say that over the course of that time, ActionAid came to have one of the best local understandings of HIV/AIDS and one of the strongest emerging local voices on HIV/AIDS.
Let's just transition to your role in the White House.
Oh, I wasn't in the White House. I was a White House fellow assigned to the Department of State.
Yeah, that role. Okay. I think you spoke about it briefly, like how one gets to be part of that.
And it's a White House selection committee, but then you get assigned to a cabinet agency.
So according to what we've read, you were attached to the OGAC office, right?
Yes.
When you were in that position, and you worked with the first coordinator.
Yes.
How was that like?
It was amazing. It was amazing. So when I was first, when my fellowship year started, the first OGAC ambassador was not yet confirmed. He had been nominated, but he wasn't yet confirmed. Okay. So I couldn't be assigned to work with him yet. So when I first started working at the Department of State, I worked with the Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs, Paula Dobriansky, and her team. And that team was amazing. They had been instrumental, for example, in setting up the Global Fund to combat HIV/AIDS. They worked with a lot of multilateral institutions and partners, and so they had been the office that had done the most work within the State Department on combating global HIV/AIDS up until the establishment of the Global AIDS Coordinator and the Office of the Global AIDS Coordinator. And that's when a lot of the sort of policy and practice associated with the State Department's role on global AIDS transferred to that office. So I was really privileged to work with the Undersecretary for about my first 6 weeks on the job. And from that role, I started attending the initial strategy development sessions that were being held by the developing OGAC team. So it wasn't yet a team, it wasn't yet an office. You had detailees from multiple US government agencies who, they had each assigned a leader who would they would gather around, a long conference table and hash out policies and approaches. And I remember, I think one of my first meetings, I was what they call a backbencher, because I was nobody to these folks. So I was sitting in the back, sort of half representing Undersecretary Dobriansky's office in this meeting that was a strategy session among these initial OGAC leaders. And Ambassador Tobias, who was not yet confirmed, was also a backbencher because he wasn't yet confirmed. Mm-hmm. So he could listen in on the conversation, but he wasn't supposed to make any decisions because he wasn't yet confirmed in his role. And the conversation was around how to respond to the legislative requirement that the Office of the Global AIDS Coordinator develop and publish a strategy that would be shared with Congress. And it was a super interesting conversation because the conversation around the table among these interagency representatives, the decision they were making was which consulting firm should get the contract to write the, they had proposals from various consulting firms, and they were making some decisions about, who should be assigned the project to help write the strategy. And Ambassador Tobias, and I was very confused by this because I was an outsider. I didn't know how government worked. That's part of the point of the fellowship. But I was very confused by it because I felt like, shouldn't the strategy be developed by the team? Doesn't it need to be developed with input from all of these practitioners and from partners on the ground? Isn't that how the strategy needs to be developed? It seemed odd to me that you could, sort of hire somebody to write the strategy. But of course I didn't say anything because I'm new and what do I know? It's my second week in government. But Ambassador Tobias raised his hand and said, I'm confused by this process. I feel like this is a strategy that we should be developing. Mm. Your strategy is your roadmap for what you're going to do. It's your means by which you develop, it's the means by which you identify your strengths and manage your weaknesses. It's the means by which you communicate with everyone who's going to be part of implementation. It's how you develop buy-in. It's how you develop the most sound approach. We should be the ones developing the strategy. And it was really great to see that kind of leadership emerge around the development of the emergency plan for AIDS relief. And ultimately, Ambassador Tobias's leadership had a tremendous amount to do with how differently this program was developed. He brought a real private sector mindset to it, which is to say, we should have a few narrow priorities, because if you have too many, you won't accomplish them. You'll be a mile wide and an inch deep, is what he used to say all the time. So you really have to have only a few priorities. They have to be measurable because, what you measure is what you do. And that's gonna drive the allocation of resources. And, and you have to be transparent. And sort of those initial principles, like strategy is what we develop in collaboration with our partners and experts on the ground. We're going to be very narrowly focused and we're going to be measurable, which means everything we do you have to be able to draw a line from what we're doing to a goal we said we were going to achieve on the numbers of HIV/AIDS infections we said we were going to reduce, the numbers of people that we said we were going to get medication to, the numbers of people that we said we were going to provide care to. Everything you do has to reach back to one of these goals in a measurable way, and in a time period that you can account for and use to make adjustments to how you're allocating resources and time and energy. Those principles were very new design principles in the development of such a large-scale program. So it was amazing to be in on the ground floor of seeing how those principles really drive action and drive the development of the program and helped make a lot of really critical decisions. Like I remember so many really difficult debates. You know, it was a very large pot of money that Congress had appropriated for global AIDS. So naturally, everybody in the development ecosystem wanted to describe their program as an HIV/AIDS program, right? I'm doing an education program, and women who are educated have a better chance of, you know, not getting HIV/AIDS and not passing it on to their children. This is true. At the same time, you can't track that investment back to, and this many infections were prevented in this year. And therefore, as painful as it was, we're not making investments in broad education. We're going to make investments in narrow HIV/AIDS education. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
You know, nutrition programs, you know, road building, like any number of these programs you could say, you know, like lead back to part of the response to HIV/AIDS. But what Ambassador Tobias really drove us to do is say, can you count it? Can you get from this intervention to a measurable outcome in a year? Because we're reporting on an annual basis. Mm-hmm. And if you couldn't do that,
falls out.
Mm-hmm. And it was super hard and really painful. It broke a lot of China, as we say. You know, like it was very painful. But it was that approach, like rigorous, evidence-based, measurable, time-bound, like all these things that you hear are supposed to be essential to your strategy. And like he really deliberately built them into the foundations of how the program was developed, and it made all the difference.
How much longer were you able to live through? I know when you came in, the office was not yet, you know, in place. And how much further were you in?
Well, what was amazing is having intended to just do a year-long fellowship program. At the end of my fellowship year, I was invited to stay on for an additional year with the team. Mm-hmm. So then I stayed on for an additional year. And then at the end of that year, I was invited to stay on for an additional year. So I stayed on again. And I think I ultimately did 3.5 years with PEPFAR. And then Ambassador Tobias was selected to really bring those foreign aid management practices to a broader portfolio of foreign aid. And so when he was selected to be the USAID administrator and the first Deputy Secretary of State for Management and Resources, he asked if I'd join that team as well. So that's when I left PEPFAR, but to bring these principles to a broader set of our foreign aid programs. One thing you absolutely need to know is this extraordinary thing. You know, so two of the most amazing things in my first year with PEPFAR. One, I came to be able to be one of the primary authors, working very closely with Ambassador Tobias, of the first PEPFAR 5-year strategy. And that was amazing. So if you think about what I'm describing, like what do I wish global superpowers were doing? And then I got to hold the pen
to put it down on paper.
Developing the strategy. You know, I wasn't by far the only person. Like there's so many experts that contributed to it. But it was incredible to and again, this is like so American, right? Like I feel like only in America could, you know, somebody like me, you know, born to parents from a country with whom we have no diplomatic relationship, right? Like an enemy of the United States, you know, only in America could I come to hold, you know, high-level positions in government that would allow me within a single generation to like hold the pen on something that I felt so passionately about and wanted to contribute to. Like only in America would that space be made for somebody like me to be able to make my contribution to something at literally the highest levels at which it was being done. You know, is amazing. And then the other enduring memory from that time, you know, even more in some ways than holding the pen on the HIV/AIDS strategy, being among the people who was, you know, who were among the primary authors for the HIV/AIDS strategy was I got to write the first draft of Secretary Powell's World AIDS Day speech that December.
That was the first, right?
I don't think it was the first World AIDS Day,
Okay.
but it may have been the first time that a U.S. leader was making a speech on World AIDS Day. I'm not sure about that. But if you, again, think about the fact that I was dreaming about what I wished American leaders would do and say about this, and then I got to hold the pen on what Secretary Powell would share with the world about what the U.S. was going to do on global AIDS and why. It was amazing. It was really amazing.
That's a nice closing remark. Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, you might not have had like a verbal voice in those different forums and meetings and whatnot, but you sit there and you just consume everything.
And you consume
just put
and
it
you
down,
influence.
all down.
You know, and there's just amazing opportunities to have impact. Amazing opportunities to have
If there was no PEPFAR, you've never maybe would have had an opportunity to work in a State Department.
No, because I wouldn't have. I mean, it was because of that I applied. You know, I wanted to work on that project.
Yeah, there we go. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.